I'm not going to waste a million miles of time with PowerPoint today. There are millions of decks by Microsoft, millions of presentations that cover that stuff. And 90% of the time, we're talking about this is what we might do in a lab environment. But when you get into the real world, you get your fingers burnt pretty hard. And this crap that seems great on paper really doesn't work. Or if it does work, it works for you, but it will not scale beyond it worked for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a turn around, and I'm basically going to talk a little bit about how we make this stuff work. We'll try and answer those questions so that as you leave here at the end of the day, I hope that you will be able to pull away an approach and answer some of the doubts or the questions or the challenges in your mind of how to do infrastructure. The primary target of this is probably from the ops perspective, because generally the ops team have the much larger curve in this journey. Dev teams have already been using the build tools. Okay, I'll slow down, Elizabeth. Thank you. First piece of good comments. So the dev teams generally don't have a lot of problems using pipelines and all of this type technology in order to build their applications. They're very comfortable with the idea of a build controller and a release and making things work. The IT team, on the other hand, well, we're a process-driven operation. We have guys that are skilled on doing a particular activity, and then once they've got that activity down pat, they may train more people in to do the same thing, but that is their domain of experience. That is their domain of knowledge, and they're generally not the best people in the world to want to actually transfer that over onto other people's domains, or more importantly, they may not want to actually learn the other person's domain. Think of the DBA sitting in the IT team, and think of the network guy in the IT team, and then think of the Azure guy. Those guys are not going to cross-pollinate information between each other very often. Yet, that's exactly what's been assumed is going to happen when we talk about doing DevOps and making IT DevOps. And then you get the opposite side, and we talk about no ops. We don't need to worry about any of this stuff. So there's a whole load of utopian bullshit, if you don't mind me stating it, because none of this is really real, and none of this actually can be done in the real world. So we need to figure out what can be done, and why does DevOps matter? Why do we talk about that topic when we speak about cloud? And I'll tell you why, very simply, because we can automate the stuff in the cloud where I couldn't automate the stuff in the data center. If I wanted to automate the building of a new VMware host and a number of VMware clients connected into the fabric, the only automation I could do is call my team and tell them get their butt down to the data center with the new servers, rack it and stack it, and then come back. So the robots in this place, well, they were my team, my humans. And in the cloud, well, the robot in this scenario is the ARM system, the Azure Resource Manager system. So I don't actually need to have a human in. And as a result, it's easier for me to actually do this infrastructure in code approaches in the cloud, because I can actually do end-to-end. Where the reality is on premise, and the IT teams all know this, you can only do so much of the puzzle, but you can't do the lot. We don't all have the luxury of running fully software-defined networks across our data center. And lots of us have spent time trying to do that with VMware or Microsoft's virtual machine manager and the software-defined networking stack and the software-defined storage stack. But let's be honest, it's not all that. There is a whole lot of, I need to get under the hood to make this stuff work. So you can't depend on that. And if we can't depend on it, then we're not going to do it. We have other things for doing. So with this fabric in place, one of the first challenges that I come up with, and Kevin, you might be able to help me with this, is that we've got guys over in the dev team that are essentially known as the architects. And funny enough, we have architects over in the IT team as well. What's their role? What's their job? What do you expect these guys to be doing?
Fighting against each other.
Well, that's pretty much the reality of what happens. But if these guys were all being productive, what do you think they should have been doing?
Should be collaborating.
Yeah. So and the idea is they should be collaborating before you get the single piece of artifact to put out. So I suppose the scenario here is that dev exists because of operations. Operations need to do something like run a shop or run a bank or make a manufacturing, and as a result, you need operations to write some sort of application to make life easier, gather the data, control a robot, whatever the case may be. And then as a result, the grunt work needs to be done by the IT team. Make sure that this domain knowledge is essentially put into practice, made reliable, and monitored to make sure it runs. That's the IT job. So these two architects, we would expect them to kind of sit down somewhere early in this exercise to say, well, this is what we're going to build, and this is what we need you to maintain, the dev and the ops. Fair enough? So let's take that analogy for a second, and we think about infrastructure as code. The idea behind infrastructure as code is that we can basically write the ops Bible. So previously we had this ops Bible, which was essentially a Word doc saying, hey, I want to deploy a new Windows server that's going to be used for running my SQL environment. And I ended up with a big long document. And that document basically says, grab the CD from the file server, install the CD, deploy the following patches, make sure that you check these boxes as you're going through the install wizard. And when you finish doing that, we know the recipe. It's like baking a cake, and we've wrote those blogs over the years. And the reality is that it decays, and it decays pretty quick because somebody comes out with a new version of the product, and the choices have moved around, or the choices have been hidden into a registry hack at the back end, and well, your recipe doesn't really work anymore. Or your naming standard has changed in the back end, and all of a sudden I can't figure out what I'm supposed to call it. And well, the long and the short of it is your infrastructure guides, your disaster recovery guides, all of these things that we need for ops, they collect dust. They provide me absolutely no value other than making my boss happy, and more importantly, the people that are responsible for the compliance, the control docs people, well, they're happy too because we have the document for the DR. We've not tried it in about 4 years, so the chances are it'll never work when we do need it, but we have the docs, so box is ticked. So let's go back and let's think about how would we do this properly. If we were in a situation that we wanted to build an infrastructure, and that infrastructure was going to be built in a way that was reusable, how would I do that? And that's not a rhetorical question. So let's answer that by thinking in a slightly different way. In the morning, you make a decision, you want to build a brand new house. Okay, you're going to build, which means that the first thing you need to do is you need to go and talk to some boss, in this particular case, the bank man, and say, hey, I've got this mad idea. I want to get some money to build a house. Do you think there's a possibility you will approve that? And he's probably going to come back and say, yeah, I've looked at your credit ratings. I've looked at your history. You look good. You take that same scenario and bring that back into your world that is in the enterprise, and you basically go to the manager and say, hey, I've got this idea. What do you think? Would it fly? And you might get a bit of a blessing saying, yeah, I like the concept. Go get me more information. Give me a little more idea of how much money you might actually need, how much time, what resources we're going to need to make this happen. And as you do that, you're starting on a journey. What's that journey called, Kevin? Any ideas?
A painful one.
A painful one.
If you're on the upside.
It's the journey of the architect.
Yeah.
You're now going to start planning. You're going to draw this thing out, and I'm going to come up with this lovely shoebox, and then you're going to show it to the team. They look at it and say, shoebox, it's boring. I'd like to have a sunroom on that, and I'd like to have an ensuite, and I'd like to have 3 bathrooms. So you go back and you redesign this thing and you make it a little bigger, and then you're kind of thinking, I'm going to need a bit more money. This thing's getting a bit bigger, but you know, there's a good reason for this, and I might get away with it. Now, if we continue that process over a couple of weeks, we'll get to a point when we have a nice architecture. We have a plan of action of what we're going to do. And that's generally what we're seeing happening over in the dev world. How often do you see that happen in the IT world? Right? And then think about that a second time, because that's not really a fair question. The IT guys do architect, but do they architect with the dev architects at the same time? That's probably no. At least in most of my experiences so far, it's no. There's a handoff between the architect and the dev saying, hey, this is what we need, and then the handoff from the architect in IT saying, this is what we can do. So when you turn around to me and say, hey, I want you to run this in Oracle, The IT guy on the opposite side might be saying, yeah, but we only run Microsoft SQL. And the debate begins. So if we take that same scenario, how are we actually going to successfully build that house? If one man says, hey, I want to build it from timber, and the other guy says, I want to build it from block, well, do the architectures work? Does that design work? The chances are it doesn't. And more importantly, who am I going to hand that to next? I need to hand it up to the boss, first of all, so that he can scale in and bring in the right peoples. Now, am I bringing in carpenters or am I bringing in blockies to do the blocks? What resources am I ordering? Am I ordering a bale of bricks or am I ordering a lot of lumber? And how long is it going to take me to build, right? So immediately at the start, we're in trouble because we really have not figured out what's going to happen. So if we take that journey a little bit further and we got that house built, we're going to actually make it livable. We're going to want to put in floors and furniture and stuff. And you know that it's not the original architect that has any opinion on what goes into it. No. That is everybody else. These guys are going to come in with their applications and look, we put up that app and that original architecture, we got it into production and then we realized that, well, we didn't have this a piece of monitoring or we didn't have this feature added and we get a pile of drift. Is that drift included in the architecture documentation? No. So if we start with all of this in the background, and then we think about how do we go to the cloud, there's a pretty serious analogy here. The typical experience is when I go into the cloud, I come in here and I say, I want to create a new resource. I figure that I want a new website. And then as I work through this wizard, I start architecting backwards. I log into this thing and then I realize pretty quickly that, well, in order for me to actually have this website, I need to know some answers. Where am I going to build it? Where have I got the planning permission for? How am I going to actually plumb this into the actual sewage system? All of these things. So we know as we've done this once or twice, well, it probably will be a good idea to check to see if there's an existing sewage system or if I need to put in percolation. All of these answers need to be pre-architected. So the infrastructure got to be in place. And then if the infrastructure is in place, when the builder comes in, we'd expect that the pipework he's going to use to plug in should be pretty much standard. He can pick it up and run with it anytime he wants. So he doesn't have to have a new certification behind him saying, okay, I can plug into the plumbing system that's used in the west of Ireland. And the next project, when I go back to visit Kevin in Dublin, well, they've got a different set of pipes. So he's got to learn a whole new set of architecture and a whole new set of certifications to figure out how to connect those connectors. So we want to make sure that as we take these analogies and we move into the real world, that we architect at the start and everything we architect can be used by everybody involved in the journey. And we also need to make sure that as we start this journey, we build it in such a way that everybody agrees with it. Because if nobody agrees, then we're in a lot of trouble. So what we're going to talk about is how do I approach this? And we're going to approach infrastructure in Azure in modules, right? Think about the fact that I'm building a house. I'm going to have lumber. If I go and buy lumber, that lumber is going to come in specific types, shapes and sizes. It'll be a 2x4, a 6x8. If it's a block, it's going to be a 9-inch, or it's a cavity, or it's a slope bar, or it's a lintel, right? These are known standards. Everybody's very clear on what they're going to do once they know what they're using. But that's not the case over in Azure. That's absolutely not the case over in Azure because, well, we know the resource we're going to deploy, but there are so many choices sitting in here. And I'm not sure if I should go Windows or Linux, the runtime stack. Like on this page alone, oh my God, what am I supposed to use, right? And we could turn around and we could say that this is specific to the particular application you're about to deploy, but is it? Is it really? Is it part of the architecture to be absolutely generic for every single thing we do? Because that becomes pretty interesting from a monitoring perspective. And this also becomes part of this challenge we have with IT not really wanting to be cooperative at this point because there are simply too many choices. And then you've got the opposite side of the coin. Well, we just use governance to sort that out. I just hide all those options and we're just going to go with this. So that's not architecture either. That's behavior enforcement, and that behavior enforcement forces, well, shadow IT. We don't need IT if that's the case. We'll just do it in our own subscriptions. So how I propose we do this is we go back and we follow exactly how every other industry works. We take a modular approach and we look at the things that we build, and you'll see, as I'm showing you on screen here, the stuff that we build is the common pieces. I've asked.
We're not seeing your screen, dude.
Oh man, well that's not good. So let me just see if we can fix that. Hang on. You've been looking at my ugly mode for too long. I apologize. So now you see my screen. Let's see if I can zoom this in a little bit bigger to make it. There you go. Right. So what I'm showing is essentially what I like to call the Lego blocks. Right, and I'm calling them Lego blocks because now I'm not actually talking about lumber or bricks, but I'm actually still talking in the same concept. And these are my Lego blocks. These modules build something. So in this particular case, it doesn't take an absolute genius to figure out that, well, this one's going to build a firewall, this one's going to do a gateway, this one's going to do a key vault. So what's so special about these? Why would I want to do this? Well, what's special about these is that the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to document it. I'm going to turn around and say, look, this block is going to give you exactly what it says it is, a key vault, a set of policies, and from that, I can turn around and make this thing a little bit more readable. I can turn around and say, there is a set of things you need to tell me. And if I zoom outwards, maybe this thing will read a little bit easier, or even if I had a preview, it might even read even. Yeah, there you go. So what matters here is I can turn around and say, is this mandatory? No, 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 yes, no, 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 right? So this block is great at building a key vault, but this block, you don't need to know much about it. You can be a junior brickie that has never built another house before. You can stand beside the guy that's done this a million times, but you should be able to come in here, grab the block, put it up, and end up with a key vault. First thing I've learned is I don't need to understand all of these things. It's not important to me. But if I do start using this block and I do turn on these things, I might get a different experience. I might be able to do additional pieces. And this is where this whole idea of governance and making things architecturally the same kicks in. So if we think about the world of ops today, we have this requirement that if you're going to put something into production, you need a checklist. Did you make sure you have backups? Did you make sure it's monitoring? Did you make sure it's encrypted? Are you using a size that's appropriate? How is it for cost? There are 21 items generally on this checklist, right? And the reality is for that junior, he has no idea of what any of those are. And more importantly, for the dev guy, he probably knows a quarter of them, but he certainly doesn't know the rest of them. And he doesn't need to know the rest of them because, well, that's an ops responsibility. You need to make sure you've backed up the system. You need to make sure the servers are being monitored or audited or wherever the cases may be. So this is where the first architectural changes must happen. The building blocks that we're going to use is pure Azure, right? We're going to take all of the standard Azure ARM templates and there's no rocket science going on here. I can come over into this and I can quickly go and I can look at the Azure Quick Start templates that are open for everybody in GitHub to use. But there is something that I'd like to call out here. Quick Start templates are exactly that. They're Quick Start. They get you going. They show you a quick way of doing something like putting together a domain service. But these are not production ready. These should not be used in production in any shape or form because you won't have backups, you won't have monitoring, you won't have auditing, you won't have all of those things that an IT operation is going to turn around and say, well, look, I can't let that go into production, man. It's wrong size. It's all of these different things haven't been done right. Have you forced it into the right region? So these really help to get you figured out, how do I actually start writing my infrastructure code? They're really good examples to get some of that stuff done. People have gone to a lot of trouble to get us running. But in your organization, you need to take that to the next phase. I need to think about things like, well, my favorite one. What am I going to call it? What am I going to call it? What am I going to call it? What is my naming standard, right? That's always a really good battle. How do I name my resources? There are so many posts, many discussions, many everything about naming standards. If you are running an operation, I assume at this point that both dev and ops know how you name resources. But then if you take a look at naming resources, you'll quickly learn that this is not a really fun experience. But you'll also learn that a proper naming standard is something that you could compute. I could figure out that if it's a virtual machine, I'll probably go to hyphenate it with VM. If it's a network interface, I'll probably hyphenate it with vNIC. And if it's got 2 or 3 network interfaces, I'll probably put a number on it that's incrementing based on the interface number. So there's logic behind how I name things. If that's the case, then take a look at this template that I'm showing you on screen. And what I want you to note here is that we're looking at the parameters that we pass in when we say I want to use this block. This block, remember, is going to give me a key vault in this scenario. Look what's not here. And what's not here is a request for you to give me the resource's name. I do not ask you to name your resource during that point of deploying it. Why? Because there's no need to. And if I do ask you to name it, what's the percentage chance that you're going to make a mess out of it? Yeah, pretty close to 100% chance. So we make this very simple. We have an architecture which says that everything that we put into Azure follows a governance, and part of that governance is a naming standard. So therefore, I don't need you to actually start learning the naming standard off. You're never going to read it anyways. Truth be, how many people have read any of your governance documentation? But if you use the block, I can figure out pretty quickly that if my naming standard is going to be built, I'm going to say, well, the naming standard is probably based on the resource group name. So let's figure out where that is. Let's figure out where we're deploying this stuff to. So what data center are we putting it into? If we need some unique characters, because, well, some resources like a key vault have to be globally unique, can't use this name anywhere else on the planet. So therefore, to build the name for my key vault, I'm going to turn around and say, look, it's going to be the resource group name and a unique string with a hyphen and a suffix that I use for my key vault, which in this particular case is -kv. Straight off the bat, I have just got to a point of essentially building an architecture and an environment that is reusable. I'm doing governance without actually having to think about it, without having to tell anybody, and we're doing a naming standard without actually making things difficult. It's done for us, right? So this is the first piece of this library of infrastructure blocks. Now let's take that block for one more second, and then we leave this, and let's pick the block that everybody uses, the virtual machine block. Now, what I want you to notice here is that there is one virtual machine block. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 samples for deployment with that virtual machine block. And if you look closely, you'll see this is a domain controller, this is Linux, this is SSH, this is VPN. So this one Lego block, by passing in slightly different configuration information, is going to basically say, hey, I want to use the Windows operating system. If I click on the Linux one, I'm going to use the Ubuntu operating system. Now let's quickly come back here to the quick start just for a second. And if I come into quick start and I'd say that I'd like to have a virtual machine, Control F, VIRT. So I got build-in role virtual machine, virtual WAN, virtual network, and then of course go for the ever hitting VM, and holy God, there's 212 templates for virtual machines. Which one should I use? Yes, of course. What is the answer, Kevin? None. None. Absolutely none, because they're quick starts and they are for reference only. When you come to your environment, this is the one you use, because there is only one. I'm asking you again, and look at the parameters. I'm not offering you the name, not necessary, because we build the name automatically based on governance. Look at all of these other parameters, and there's a lot of parameters in this. This is a really ugly template, Damian. You've got a lot of parameters. But please take a very close look. Every single one of these, or almost every single one of these, has a default, which simply says, if you don't tell me, then you don't have a problem. I'll go with the basics. I'm not going to stand up here and say, hey, you have to answer this thing. And it's like guessing the lottery. Did he document it? Well, nope, he didn't. Gosh. So really and truly, I have no idea what he needs to put in here. Right. So the first thing on these building blocks is make sure that you document it. And secondly, make these optional. There's no need for these not to be optional. You are building a governed architect environment. You know what they are. I'm passing in the connection for an operating system. I can turn around and say, I'm capable of giving you Windows or Unix operating systems. I'm doing this in one template. Templates are kind of smart. I can scroll down a little piece or a long piece, depending on how many different optional parameters I have. And again, notice these are all optional. When I come down here and I start looking at this thing, look at this piece of code again. Resource group, resource name, VM prefix. And I'm now starting to figure out, do I need to add an availability set name? If somebody passed me an availability set, then let's add that to the name. If they didn't, don't. Did you pass me in a diagnostics piece? If you did, then let's figure out how we're going to name the diagnostics. All of the names are built as part of this environment. But let's go back to that more interesting one. What happens to the operating system you passed in? Is this a Windows operating system? So again, I can take a look at the list of the operating system choices that we had. If the word Windows was in it, well then guess what? It was a Windows OS because it was Windows 2016 and Windows 2019. So it was pretty easy. And as a result of that, then I can turn around and say, right, depending on which of those you chose, this is probably going to be the block that I need to insert into the code. So further down, I will have the process of actually building the actual virtual machine, and I can do a condition. I can turn around and say, right, okay, so we're going to deploy you a virtual machine. Let's find it. It's down here somewhere. There's your virtual machine deployment. Again, we commented to make it easy to find it. In here, we're going to turn around and say, how many VMs do I need? Count them, 1, 2, 3. So I didn't give you an answer, but I'll go with 1 by default. And more importantly, as I scroll in here, I'm going to make some decisions saying, look, give me the Linux configuration if the operating system isn't Windows. Is Windows? Provide this. Is not Windows? Give me null, right? So the one block does everything. So your very first stop in this journey is build a library of modules that you can reuse. Now, we had a question at the very start. And that question at the very start was essentially, should I do this in JSON or should I do this in YAML? Right? Odd question when I stop at this point, but a really appropriate one at this point. Everything that we see here is done in JSON. I write all of my modules in pure ARM. There are no exceptions. The only time that there is an exception is if I cannot communicate with Azure directly through ARM. So if something is not in the control plane and I need to go to the data plane, then and only then will I actually leave the ARM environment. Otherwise, it is always completed in ARM. Now, the question then comes back, JSON versus YAML. And I have advocated previously in different speeches to go with YAML because it is a lot less verbose, right? This is somewhat tough to read. Now, there's lots of colors and we've got curly brackets and all of these things that make it easy to find. So I would certainly say turn these functions on, and VS Code makes that easy with color bracket extensions and all of those different things. But the more important point here is that the single reason that I previously suggested that we should go forward and use YAML was because YAML had comments and JSON did not. That was the one and only true reason, beyond the fact that it's a little bit more compressed. Comments. But today, that's different. We can now do comments in JSON for ARM. So I can comment this thing as much as I like in pure JSON, which then means that everybody that is working with ARM, either in your team or somebody you've hired, somebody you want to share the templates with, they all are now looking at something that is native to them. If you need to convert from YAML to JSON and it's for an ARM template, there's a lot of people going to be looking at you saying, that's not an ARM template, it's in the wrong format, that's YAML, and I don't expect YAML. So they will make an assumption then that, well, maybe this is Terraform. But it's not Terraform either, because Terraform is not YAML. It's formatted like YAML, but it's not YAML. It's HashiCorp Configuration's hack of it, or HashiCorp Configuration language of it, if that's what they want to market it as. But it's not YAML. Now, let me ask that question a slightly different way. Why would I bother writing this thing in ARM templates, which is pretty complicated to look at when you look at it on screen, instead of writing this thing in Terraform, which, let's be honest about it, is a lot more readable? when we look at a basic configuration. Terraform, when you start looking at a more complex configuration, ends up getting pretty verbose. And I can tell you that because I'll be honest, I started this journey writing all of this stuff in Terraform. I lasted about 9 weeks in that exercise. And then I finally gave up because two learnings came out of it. The first learning was that Terraform got extremely verbose and extremely complicated when I started trying to actually build these reusable blocks. The second one, which is even more irritating, and the reason I gave up, was that while I could do the initial core pieces like a virtual machine or a network interface or a key vault, when I want to do something a little bit more advanced, for example, store the passwords for the virtual machine in the key vault, well, that's when things got nasty. Because at the point in time that I was using it, the answer to that question was, now you need to learn how to write some Python to make a new module for Terraform. And if you didn't want to do that, well, they had another answer. They kind of frowned on it, but it was a good answer. Write it in an ARM template, and then we'll wrap the Terraform template around it. So I'll give it a big hug and make it feel nice and warm. And I'm sitting here and I'm doing that for about 2.5 weeks. And then one of my colleagues comes across and says, right, you've written a thing in ARM and now you put a Terraform thing around it. Why did you do that? Why did you just use the ARM template? And you're sitting back and you're thinking to yourself, you're right. You're absolutely right. Why am I making more work for myself here? And in the long and the short of it, that's exactly what I was doing, making a whole lot more work for myself. So I finally took our architecture, went back, looked at the thing and says, this is going to be a lot tougher to write if we do this in pure ARM. We're going to have a tough learning curve of getting everybody figuring this stuff out, but there will be absolutely nothing we can't do as long as we can do it in ARM. So we done that, and we took the learning curve. And the learning curve didn't actually turn out to be too hard at all, because once you figured out how to do this stuff in YAML, Terraform, you actually had all the concepts. So it actually turned out that it was a really smart thing to do. And I would highly encourage anybody that hasn't started this journey to do this. Start doing your infrastructure code for the first times using Terraform. It'll get you the concepts. It'll teach you really quickly how to get to grasp with the stuff. But when you're ready to get serious and you want to build that library and you want that library to start scaling, then I'm probably going to upset some people, but I'll take that challenge. And please unmute if I'm going to upset you in this statement. But at that point, dump Terraform. Move over and move into native Azure, native ARM, and start working your way across. Now, there's going to be one or two haystayers sitting in the background that should at this time be fuming. And there's going to be one or two people that have read the marketing material and are choking on it, thinking, well, Terraform means that if I write this thing in Terraform, I can deploy it to something other than Azure, for example, AWS or Google Cloud. Excuse me when I say this, bullshit, right? Because it is exactly that. That Terraform module that you've created was created specifically for the provider that is Azure. You cannot take that same piece of Terraform and deploy it to AWS, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, or anything else. You need to create that module specifically for that target resource. So it is not portable. Despite the marketing making you feel like it is, what the marketing should truly mean is that Terraform can target any of those resources. But your definition is not targetable. It is written to that endpoint. And in our case, we're going to write that endpoint directly in ARM. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second. I'm hoping there's one or two questions in the pipe.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping I've answered Theo's question too.
Okay, so I've got two questions from the good folks on the attendee list, right? So Theo asked a question, how do you handle dependencies when using the blocks? And also, I'll give you the second one that we have at the moment as well. Elizabeth also asked, are you using the ARM template toolkit or the ARM TTK? And what's your opinion on that one as well?
Right. Okay. So these are excellent questions, and they're lining me up very nicely here. So let's take the first question. Remind me what that was again.
Okay. First question from Theo was, how do you handle dependencies when using the blocks?
So I don't. One of the things that we don't do is do linked templates, right? That's important. So let's take a closer look at one of these templates. And here is one that I was actually working on during the week. And it is app services. And this will become very apparent in a moment. Now, I'm going to leave these templates in a moment, but one of the things I want you to note, again, is the parameters take in the configuration. And I am basically using optionals for every single one of these, right? Default, default, default. That is the most important thing here. So this block will build something. When it's finished building something, it must output something on the far end. It must turn around and say, hey, I just built this particular thing. It is now called this resource in Azure. It has this name in Azure. And this is the function key. In this particular case, this will deploy me a web app or a function app. So depending on if it's a function app or web app, he's going to actually say, well, if it's a function app, I'll give you back the key. If it is a web app, I'm going to give you back nothing, right? Remember, the block is agnostic. And now, how do I know if this thing that I've just asked the block to build, because I called it an app service thing? Well, let's go back to the input. Let's go back up here to the start. Right up and right here, that thing that says function storage name, that's optional. Name of the storage account to use for a function app. If this parameter is set, it switches from an app to a function app. And I do that down here in the variables, where I do a quick check to say, well, what did I call it? So the web app name, get me the resource group, get me the unique string, put me the suffix for the type of app I'm deploying. The suffix for the type of app I'm deploying. Well, if the function storage name was blank, then it must be a web app. But if the function storage name was provided, then it might be a function app, right? You get the idea here. The logic is in the module now. This is what makes this thing far more portable than the quick starts. Quick starts are good to get snippets out of. This is production stuff. More importantly, now that I've answered that question, I can move in here and I can say, right, so if I'm going to be deploying these things, I can take different settings. So if it's a function app, maybe the settings I need to provide are going to be different. So the default function settings are going to be these ones, but the default web app settings are going to be these ones, right? Again, governance is named up. We have all of these production ready things in place. Same idea here. If you look, again, application insights agent, we're binding this thing right here in the actual module's parameters. So before I even start building, I'm architecting. I'm deciding what do I need in, what am I going to give out, and then the core logic. So if you're a developer, you'll start figuring out what's going on in here. All of my Lego blocks are microservices. They take in an API, they do a little bit of business work, they hand out the output. Okay? Treat infrastructure like a microservices application, and you are in a new world. Now, this is why I started the journey talking about the idea of architecting a house, because now I'm planning to the fact that this block, it can be a transparent block, or it can be a solid block that I can't see through. It can be a web app, it can be a function app, it can be a Windows machine, it can be a Linux machine. Depending on what I pass in, what this thing will do, well, it's all down here to the concepts of, should I do this? So turn on web app insights, give it a name, okay, give it the tags, right? All of these things are in here, and I'm now basically saying that everything will have a minimum version of all of these things. But more importantly, then, as I start saying that, well, I want to actually get the function app key, then I don't deploy this piece if I'm not deploying a function app. I skip it because, well, there's no function app keys on a web app, so don't deploy that thing. Okay, so this is the important piece. So then asking me, what do I do next? I will basically say, give me the function, deploy it, and when you're finished, hand me back the results. Then I'll take the next thing I need to deploy, and I might need to use the results of the previous task and actually use those as the inputs to the next. So they become the parameters for the next thing. A very typical example, I need to do monitoring. I build a proper environment. The very first thing I should deploy in any environment is my log analytics. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to basically turn around and I'm going to find my log analytics environment right close to Kevin's heart. And it's a workspace. I deploy my workspace. I don't ask for a lot of information. Again, defaults, 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 defaults. So anybody can deploy this thing, and I'll show you in a moment. But more importantly, again, I figure out the names. So all of the naming, everything is done. So the governance, the production readiness is covered. And on the output side of the world, well, I give you back what you need to know. The resource group it's in, workspace name, its location, and more importantly, the ID for the workspace. Now let's go back and look at that virtual machine for a second. Now, if I said I don't link templates, one of the things I will want to do is I will maybe, for example, want to turn on Windows updates on virtual machines, and I'd like to know that the virtual machine's actually been monitored. So down here in the list of all of the different things I could potentially pass in, and I say could because, again, defaults kick in here. If I scroll down on this particular template, I have a workspace ID. It's optional. You don't need to give it to me. But if you give me the workspace ID that you just deployed, then if I take this, Control C, Control F, scroll down here, the first thing I'll figure out, if the workspace ID was empty, then hey, we're not going to be needing it, but otherwise, strip it back and just give me that piece of the ID, the actual workspace code, not the resource list. And as a result, I can then come back and say, Nick Diagnostics, did you provide me a workspace ID? If you didn't, we won't turn on diagnostics. If you did, then I'm going to turn on the diagnostics for the network interface. Production ready checklist, done, right? I do the same thing for backups. Did I pass in a recovery vault ID? If I did, we'll add that function in. Did you pass in an automation account ID? If I did, Windows updates get turned on, right? You get the idea here. I'm not teaching people how to architect a new house. I'm doing that in the infrastructure. These modules become very useful. And then I don't need to do mad, silly linkings and all of that, because the question Elizabeth asks is, do I use the ARM TTK? Well, let's put VS Code to the side for a second and let's answer that question. So let's come over here, and I'm in DevOps, right? And if I put DevOps up on screen, what I want to show you guys is my repository. And in the repository, I can see exactly the same thing I showed you a few moments ago. So here are all my modules and the last update. So one of the first things is obviously everything is in code. Everything is in code. And the other thing I want you to note here is there is more than one person committing to this, right? There is more than I in this team. Lots of us are working on this thing. So we can basically turn around, we can add new features into this library all the time. And as a result of that, I can have lots of checks coming in. So this one, for example, you're seeing failed and failed. Damian added this feature to add a new exportable function key. I just showed you that in the template. But now my module has failed. Why did that fail? Well, let's take a closer look. So here's the changes I done. I basically turn around and it says that the tags, well, there's nothing serious on that. But more importantly, down here, I put in this thing I showed you moments ago. If it's a function app, show me the API key. And then down here in the output, if it was a function app, tell me what the key is. Right, that was a cool piece of code. I was very proud of that. I committed it in because it was addressing a problem. But of course, something went somewhere wrong. I got these failed messages. Not so happy about that. So why has it failed? Let's click on it. Validation has failed for app services app JSON. Output contains secret. Oh, yeah, you're right. The output does contain a secret. So in this particular case, I am, Elizabeth, using the TTK, so the template test toolkit. And the TTK basically turns around and says, are you in your outputs putting out a secret that could be picked up by somebody? And the answer to that question is yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. And the TTK in this says, well, I'm sorry, that's a really bad practice, Damian. You shouldn't do that. And as a result, this infrastructure library is not actually released. This is still sitting in the test branch, and now I have two choices. I can make an exception to the rule, or I can be a good boy, and I can essentially come back and say, you know what, you're right. I shouldn't do this. Reverse my pull, reverse my change, and put it back to normal. So yes, the key message here is that we certainly do use the TTK, and it's a fabulous piece of software. It also is troublesome at times. It has a lot of checks in it that are not what I would call appropriate. So the first thing I would suggest is go into the TTK and tune it to suit your world. In my place, the TTK is actually sitting inside my same infrastructure library. So you'll see in here, I've got this thing called the toolchain and the pipeline. I've put a dot in front of these because they're essentially not important. But in here, I have the toolkits, and I have pretty much all of the normal toolkit checks that you're going to download from the internet. I have turned off a few of those checks because I don't believe they're appropriate, or certainly not in our approach for how we do the environment. But for the vast majority of the checks, they are in place, and I've added 1 or 2 more in place. But what matters in this case for anybody that hasn't done this before is that all of this is in a pipeline. So what does that translate to? It means down here in this file, I have this thing called an Azure pipeline, and I can't even see it on my screen because I probably made a smaller moment ago. Too much stuff. Yeah, okay, so I have got far too many pipelines here, so let me just do it over here where I know I can actually find it. So I'm going to just click on this one, and I'll show you the pipeline by just clicking on edit, and that way I'll be in the right place. Come on. And what we're basically saying is that every time there's a change on a branch, on a tag, or in a path, right, then I want you to start doing a build.
ഈ സമയത്ത് ആൾക്കാർക്ക് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റത്തില്ലെന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ പിന്നെ ഭയങ്കര കഷ്ടമാണ്.
2 seconds.
So in this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick validation. We want to make sure that everything is good. So we're going to run basically what we're calling the pester tests, but in English, it is the TTK in this particular case, with 1 or 2 additional tests added to it. So everything we do, every time we make a commit or a change to this branch, and anytime I do a pull request, anytime I do a release, we run through some simple things. Is your JSON good? Have we any synthetic errors? Are we breaching any of the business rules? So putting a secret in the output. If we're not, then we can stage these things to a point that actually start using them. And I also do this, update a build number. Right? So one of the things that you may have noticed subliminally in the background of all of my modules is that as we deploy things, or as I build modules, I have a variable sitting up here as a variable in, let's make this full screen so we can see it, Control B to get that thing out of the way, and I can Control that X, that one down. Right here, IAC version is undefined. Right? So it's a variable that I've put in. It's not a parameter. I don't pass it in. But during my pipeline, I basically turn around and say, hey, I want you to set the build number. Now, what does that do? It basically will look inside every JSON template. And inside that JSON template, if I see that section, IAC version, I'm going to replace undefined with this build number. So that can be a semantic version, it can be a date stamp version, whatever versioning system you want to use that you're comfortable with, that gets stamped in here. Now, what does that look like? So let's go over here to Azure and I'll show you an environment that has been built using this stuff. So I'm going to go to resource groups, not even sure what subscription I'm in, doesn't particularly matter, and I will pick a test book. And over here, if I grab a web machine, this is probably actually not the best resource group to be in. So let me come out of that one for a second, and I'm going to go to one I know I was working on only yesterday. So an Azure function. Here you can see config version, IAC version, and then this version numbering. So in this particular case, we are essentially getting the version number. 2020 is the year, 04 is the month, 22 is the date, the 7th build on that day. So I was pretty busy playing with this thing on 2 days ago or 3 days ago. But I never once built the version number. The pipelines have done those for me. So every time we do a redeployment, we can easily see what version of the infrastructure that's done. So who wants to ask the question? What's the config number, Damian? So we've built blocks. And we started this talking about the idea of an architecture. So how do I architect this stuff? Theo asked the question, JSON versus YAML. Then we had the question of how do we actually get to the point of chaining these things? How do I go from A to B to C to D? How does that work? Well, that's actually a really, really important question. So let's answer that. Close this one for a second. Control B to put back up my browser, and let's leave the library. Now, had anybody any questions on the library before I leave it? It makes sense. You've got a good idea of how to structure and why we structure, and why we don't want to use quick start.
No questions in the chat at the moment. Just keep in mind we've got probably about 3 minutes before we need to wrap up, Damian.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool.
So what we do in this particular case is we take a configuration file. And if you think about this, back to the old days of actually keeping an idea of my environment, we don't need to know how SQL installs. We just simply need to know the answers to the questions. What are we going to deploy in SQL? Right? Well, the same thing here. This document, this JSON file, is the answer to that. Tell me the modules we're going to use. So 2020-04-2207. I wonder, where do we see that number a few moments ago? Basically, give me that last version of that particular module library that you have with your fixes, Damian. And then all I'm going to turn around to you is I'm going to define my environment. Now, this is a pretty big file. I should have probably chosen a smaller one. But in here, I can define any specifics for the naming standards, and you can see they're all elements. But what matters much more, is if I scroll down a piece, I can turn around. I'm going to scroll down a good bit. Yeah, fine. And I'm going to basically turn around and say, as I want to deploy things, if I deploy a management group, I need to give it a name. But more importantly, at the management group level, I would like you to deploy at the management group the ARM module for the role definition, right? Those are the modules over here. The ARM module for the policy definition, and these are the policies I want for the VDC. These are the policies I want for the diagnostics. These are the initiatives that I want to deploy. These are the assignments I want to do. So essentially what I'm doing is, as I look at this, I'm going to turn around and say, well, okay, let's get a closer look at what actually we're going to deploy. Scroll down. And down here, I can turn around and say, look, let's get the diagnostics. So here's the resources we're going to use. We're going to pass in things like the actual name of the environment we're deploying these to. But far more importantly, this is turning around and saying, grab me the module which deploys the policies, right? And then in here, these are the parameters saying we're going to put it into this management group. These are the assignments we're going to do. So I'm going to say, well, this is a governance policy. This is a little bit of a definition on it. This is where the policy is going to be located, and these are the parameters that are going to go into that particular policy. So the configuration, these are the answers to what were the optionals for the Lego bricks. They're now sitting in one file. So if you think about this, I'm writing a solution, and that solution is about monitoring an application, and I put in 5 monitors. And then somebody comes back and says, we forgot to put in a monitor for the health of certain sort. Well, we could go into the port and we could add them. But I could also come in here and say, oh yeah, good point. I forgot that particular policy. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to insert, I'm going to paste it. I can see in my code that I've just pasted it. And now I can basically say, right, well, this is still part of governance. This is going to be the part of the governance for AZ Global. And I can then turn around and make the changes that, no, this is not going to be an audit. This is going to be a deny policy, right? Now, when I make this change, I commit it, and it goes back up over here into my good old friend DevOps. So let's see you, DevOps, please. And in this particular case, I'll show you that same repository with that same file. So click on the repositories. Repositories, come on. And then down here, and we'll take a look at that configuration file, which is this particular one. And if I look at that configuration file again, I get to see all of the change history that was going on in it. So I can turn around, somebody turned on encryption or turned off encryption on a particular folder. So let's go in there and we can see the change set. So now I can take a close look at saying, hey, encryption was enabled. Then somebody says, no, I turned it off. And why did he turn it off, right? So I can come in and I can comment and say, dude, seriously? You don't turn off encryption. That's not a right thing to do. Or we can have a chat about it. But more importantly, I know it's Radar that done it. I know when he done it. I've context to the change that's happening in my environment. So no more Word docs. No more of the doc out of date. I have the configuration here. I have the build stuff sitting in the other repository. So this tells me what I'm building. So the blueprint, my architecture that we designed with my dev and my IT team, this is the final architecture. And these were the Lego blocks that I used, that I passed over to it. So now all there's left for me is to actually deploy this environment. And if I want to deploy this environment, all I'm doing is I'm taking a look and saying, hey, did anybody change the Lego block, or did anybody change the actual configuration? So in this particular case, I'm looking at the configuration for what we call the sandbox. And if that's the case, I'm basically saying, hey, somebody made a change to the configuration for the sandbox. Let's run a new one, just for argument's sake, so you guys can see what this looks like. Click run. So this assumes I've just made a change. And as a result, I'm basically going to start running a PowerShell. That PowerShell is going to take a look at it and he says, right, where are your Lego blocks? We saw that in the top of the configuration file. And once he's found those Lego blocks, he's then going to turn around to me and he says, right, what do I need to deal with? So all the modules like the policies and all of those different things, we're going to call those out. And in sequence, so to answer that question, I'm basically going to first deploy out the monitoring, then I'll deploy out the virtual machines, and I'll pass the monitoring piece in. And one at a time, I'm going to build out my complete infrastructure. Now, I love DevOps, but the fact that he forgot to upgrade my screen doesn't help. So here I can now see that he started the process. He's taking a look at the actual library, the building blocks, and then he's basically starting the process, turning on the resource providers, checking RBAC. So the very first thing I need to do when I'm building an infrastructure is RBAC, then management group. So I've sat and I've thought about, if I'm building a house, do I start at the roof or to start at the foundation? Well, I start at the foundation. In this particular case, RBAC groups, then management groups. And then I take a look and say, right, definitions, already deployed, nothing changed. Already deployed, nothing changed. And I walked through the whole environment. So in essence, configuration uses the infrastructure library, the building blocks, and I can then do a very quick check saying, is this building block the same version as the building block that I had sitting here in Azure? Yes, it is. Is this configuration the same version as the configuration I had in Azure for this resource? Yes, it is. Okay, well then guess what? No changes. Move on. Now I've got a really simple pipeline. Okay, that's my questions.
Damian, that was an excellent session. So we've got there's no additional questions in the chat. I think you've comprehensively answered Theo and Elizabeth's questions. What we'll do and what we've done for the previous speakers, Damian, is we've asked the speaker to hang on for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. If anybody else has some questions, they can post them up in the chat, and we can work together to make sure that we get those answered. But I think feedback from what I've seen from everyone is another excellent and awesome session. And I always personally learn something as an ops guy coming to a DevOps presentation from you. So thanks so much, Damian. Really, really appreciate it. And as I said, anybody has any questions for Damian, please post the questions to the chat. He'll hang around for the next 10 or 15 minutes at least. And next up, we're going to have Gosha and Gregor introduce Dwayne for his certification session. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for your time.